Welcome back. We're really excited to close out this morning with this final panel. We have three incredible leaders with us, all very active in contemporary activities associated with placemaking and place management. What I'd like to do is just start off with a simple round of introductions. Tim, why don't you just start us off? Give us a little bit of background of how you got into this conversation and how it fits into your professional trajectory and what you're doing today.
So I did economic development for the city for a while, and then started something called Partnerships for Parks.
And by city you mean?
New York City. Sorry. Apologies.
City.
Partnerships for Parks, which was helping neighborhood parks groups in public spaces. Worked a lot with Project for Public Spaces, learned a lot from them, and then went on to manage and run the Times Square Alliance, which is one of the biggest business improvement districts in New York, and then worked with a collection of smaller business improvement districts through the BID Association there, the International Downtown Association. When I was doing the park stuff, I also worked with community parks groups, and now I'm doing a lot of thinking with folks like you about this at NYU, where I teach about cities.
And we're really excited to partner with NYU on this series. And let me just also say, and I'm just going to ask you to talk just a little bit more. Times Square is a place. It's one of the most amazing places in the world. If you just reflect just a tiny little bit, and we'll move on to other things after that.
Yeah, it's fundamentally, it's about understanding, the nature of a place. And there we talked about creativity and energy and edge were some of the essential qualities of that place. But it wasn't that different from the work that the Bronx River Alliance did, where they said, what are the communities around this place? What are the assets that we have? And how do we pull together and develop relationships among the people in and around that place, with the city and government, and with the private sector and the real estate folks, to try and make the whole greater than the sum of its parts.
It's so interesting, because that does really speak to an emerging set of practices, which I think is transferable. Super interesting. Kenyatta, you are both the leader of a place management organization today, but very importantly, you're also the leader of a network, a place-based network of place management organizations. Please share with us a little bit about your background and kind of what you do today.
Sure. So I'm the president and CEO of the Mount Vernon Triangle Community Improvement District. We're one of DC's 11 business improvement districts. I think I may have had the shortest commute here. Our organization is just north of Massachusetts Avenue. And so been doing that work for 7 years. Came to it from a background, very unique. I did public-private partnerships. Actually, I worked with someone who you were talking to earlier, Valerie Santos, at Jones Lang LaSalle. I lived in Mount Vernon Triangle. My footprint was national, sometimes international. And so I would sometimes know more about what was happening in Battle Creek, Michigan than, say, in my own backyard. This opportunity to run the SID came about in 2016 or so. I go from having a national footprint to one that is extremely hyperlocal. I would leave my front door at 8:30, I'd be at work at 8:30. And so that's how I came to this work. Working in public-private partnerships, Tim just mentioned making the whole, greater than the sum of its parts. Always looking for opportunities to optimize and maximize outcomes, make 1 + 1 = 3. And then you're always taught to look for the path to growth. And Mount Vernon Triangle is certainly why I moved there. And I saw tremendous opportunity for the neighborhood being in a path to growth for the city, and that certainly turned out to be true. Last year, my colleagues asked if I'd be willing to take the role as chair of the DC Bid Council. I'm reminded sometimes with another colleague that I'm the first, what we call small bid in our network, to actually lead the Bid Council. And so I've been doing that work for a year now, have another year in the role. But essentially, we convene the directors twice a month formally to talk, and then informally as necessary to really work on cross-cutting issues that have broad impact on the entire city.
And Tim, I know you have experience with this as well, but the Bid Council is very interesting because while we can focus on individual place management organizations, this council is kind of like an alliance between different places across our city. Very interesting.
Yeah, it's very unique in that way, and it helps us to be able to galvanize our voices. Much of the city's economic base is in one of our 11 bids, soon to be 12 bids with the coming online of Friendship Heights. And so generally speaking, I mean, there are certain core issues. There may be things that are very important to one or two bids, but we all are concerned about clean streets, safe streets, activating our communities, really nice parks and public spaces. And so we're able to come together around those issues and have conversations with city leaders and others around issues that are important to us, and therefore we believe the majority of the city as a whole.
That's great. Ethan, welcome. It's great to have you here. Share with us a little bit about your personal background, and share with us a little bit about PlacemakingX and what it represents.
Sure, yeah. So I've been very lucky to get to grow up around and learn from a lot of the best urbanists around the world, and really have the charge and challenge to build on the work of first William White and Jane Jacobs, who Rich spoke a lot about, and of course my father, who founded Project for Public Spaces, where I got to work for 20 years. But we always found that the biggest limiting factor for public spaces, and the biggest opportunity was really place management, and we worked to help support and set up and consult with hundreds of place management organizations all over the world. And a few years ago, I spun off a new organization called PlacemakingX, really to network and connect the people leading these efforts. And particularly around place management, we see that as sort of the leading edge of change in shaping cities in general, but certainly in placemaking. And but part of the reason to network it globally and connect all these, these network leaders essentially, is that every part of the world is leading with different strengths, but also has different weaknesses. And so the innovation needs to sort of keep each other in check, but but also inspire each other globally. And we really think that. Place management and placemaking at the district scale, the destination scale, is creating the sort of the mechanisms, the financial mechanisms, governance, planning, design mechanisms that really will sort of turn upside down the shaping of cities, create the systemic change that's necessary to address our bigger challenges, from climate to equity to health.
And I want to get to that. I want to really explore that. Tim, share with us a little bit about the practices themselves. You're working with multiple organizations across the whole metropolitan landscape of New York City. What are the practices, and what are the kind of needs that these place management organizations have?
Well, when I look at both across space and kinds of organizations and across time, what's interesting is that, reflecting on the theme of sustainability, is the question is, what does it take to sustain a place? And so often, these organizations, not just in New York, but in so many places, came up because places were not being sustained, and there were gaps in how vibrancy was being sustained and supported. And so it was a gap in care, usually by government, either because they didn't have the resources and just weren't that good at taking care of a place, or it could have been a gap in care because they just didn't care about public spaces in general. That led to a gap in safety, both in terms of you might not feel physically safe, but you also might not feel included or safe in the space. That led to a gap in trust among the people around that space, and especially if government wasn't taking care of things, a gap in trust between government and community. And then there was a gap in responsiveness to neighborhoods and nuance of neighborhoods. So when you have those gaps, vibrancy is not sustainable. But then stepping back from that, there's another kind of sustainability, which is sustainability of relationships. Mm-hmm. And yes, I'm afraid that means we need to talk about our relationship. And of course, nobody wants to talk about the relationship. Right. I'd rather talk about those crazy people at Burning Man. I'd rather talk about Donald Trump, anything except relationships. And people will talk, as we heard earlier, about the importance of community engagement. And what we saw is that with a dynamic local leader, or because people are really pissed off about those gaps in care, someone will step up and be engaged. But you need to sustain relationships, especially with respect to less resourced places, if you're going to have a sustainable place. And so what's happening now, a lot of our conversations, which you're working on and all of us are working on, is what are the legal, that Sheila was talking about as well, Sheila Foster, what are the legal, regulatory, structural, and financial tools that sustain relationships? Because if we just talk about engagement or helping communities, then people will nod, but you have to look behind the curtain. What's the foundation? What are the structural things that can sustain those relationships that sustain the places?
That's really interesting, and it's actually a perfect segue to you, Kenyatta, and that is, if a place management organization, of course, has its own internal strategies and needs and staffing and specific projects they're working on, you now, as chair of the DC Bid Council, are also looking at the ecosystem within which place management organizations function. This is, I think, what Tim is getting at. What are those ecosystem factors that allow for place management organizations to thrive or to just advance their mission?
Yeah, I think at the core, we all have people that we're responsive to, right? We call them stakeholders. I know the terminology is changing in a space, constituent stakeholders, but we all have to be super responsive to the people we serve, the people who pay the freight, so to speak. And so all of us, right, we have the stakeholders that we are responsive to. I do believe at the core, however, where there may be sort of disparate needs in disparate parts of the city, everyone generally wants the same fundamental things, right? They want communities where they can be successful in, communities that are livable, places they can thrive, places that are safe, places that give them meaning, right, for whatever that may be, whether it's a commercial district or residential district, or to go out and have a good time, right, in a retail corridor. So for us, I think it's important for the Bid Council to be able to temperature check as a whole and elevate those voices, right, understand them, and then reach out to people within the city leaders, officials, and others to make sure that they understand what folks are saying on the ground in real time. I think sometimes there's a latency between sort of like, this is what we need, and how governments respond and react. And I think, with our organizations, because we are so local, we have our ear to the ground, we have that opportunity to sort of be that immediate response, almost like in a political campaign, so that systems can be more responsive. So in terms of the people within the ecosystem, certainly, within city government, for us, a lot of the agency leaders. And, it kind of comes down to really kind of a handful of agencies, DDOT and DC being one of the biggest.
The transportation.
Transportation,
Yeah.
How we move people. But, not just that, the curbside, as we think about the pandemic showed us new ways that people were adapting
Right.
use of the curbside. Huge for us. DPW as well, the public works function. Obviously, policing, safety. What does that mean? We had to understand that safety meant different things to different people. We used to ask people in our own surveys, do you feel safe in our community? And then people would say, well, yeah, generally I feel safe, but I don't feel safe health-wise, because of X, Y, and Z reason, or I don't feel safe crossing the street. And so we had to understand that meant different things to different people, when we really had to sort of, break that question out and ask in multiple ways to really get at the core of what's driving your feelings of safety.
Well, and that's
within the
also
community.
so interesting, because we talked about research and data before, you're getting at a level of granularity, of a highly specific set of challenges within a neighborhood, and kind of dealing with them in a structured way.
Yeah, exactly. And so really understanding what the core needs are and being able to respond and adapt to those needs individually as organizations, as PMOs, but then also elevate that and have the conversations with people within the city government, sometimes federal government as well, with the National Park Service and Park
Right.
Police and others, to make sure that those needs are being attended to and met.
Ethan, I want to pick up the conversation that we started with Rich, and I'd love for you to reflect a little bit on placemaking as a practice. And I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how placemaking as a practice is changing and evolving as these place management organizations develop more capacity.
Sure, yeah. And in a way, we see place and placemaking as these sort of fuzzy words that the most important part of the discussion is actually debating what they mean and defining it, and for, continually defining place more holistically and understanding the layers of relationships, and how they actually place can. It is sort of a, just like love, we say it's sort of like infinitely, but and how it can support connection to each other, to place, to but how it also can erase or bury different layers too. So it's always if anyone's dominating the conversation or leading it, frankly, they're also blocking. So place is always about who's not included, and how does it become richer in a way that actually benefits most often the people that are leading it, but allows them to open up in different ways. But so placemaking, we've always emphasized as a process, and it's about building the capacity to manage and program a space. We also say that the best public spaces in the world are actually self-managed. You have to lead often with proactive management and some structure. It goes in these waves, and so different parts of the world again are coming at innovation around place management from different strengths of different sectors. So sometimes it's from government down, sometimes it's from businesses, sometimes it's activism and volunteers. Sometimes it's the developers. But the best help them. We celebrate that they're moving in that direction, moving towards place as a goal, not just their narrow delivery systems and so forth. But to best help them is to make these entities more multi-sector and more facilitative in developing relationships. And ultimately, the goal of all these organizations should be to put themselves out of a job so that people manage these spaces essentially on their own, more like these markets behind us.
Yeah, where the community capacity is there.
Yeah, exactly. Building community capacity.
The kind of the networks and lines of trust exist. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, we are going to go to questions from the audience, but before we do, I'm going to ask you a very difficult question, which is one of our core research questions that we want to explore this fall, and that is, great, so we have place management organizations, the set of practices are beginning to become better known through organizations like yours and the International Downtown Association, the Urban Land Institute, one of our partners. And often these place management organizations are responsible for or are working in some of the most important, highly visible, and often the most high-performing places in a city. So our third research question is, are these place management organizations in a position to actively manage towards the implementation of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals? And as you all know, the Sustainable Development Goals are big and broad, include so many different factors, not the least of which is addressing systemic issues of poverty in our cities, really understanding how to shift and transform urban economies into a clean energy future, and thinking about the impacts of climate change on cities and the kinds of changes that are necessary. Are place management organizations well positioned to do this work? I'm very interested in your perspective. Tim, why don't you start us off?
I think when you think about how do we sustain the planet, it's fundamentally about the competition between cities, urban areas, diverse and dense urban areas versus sprawling and segregated and car-oriented suburbs. Mm-hmm. And whether it was the 1970s of like the flight from in North America, the flight from cities, or this conversation about the urban doom loop, it's about how are you making cities appealable and livable and fundamentally competitive so that there is greater urbanization, which is the key to addressing climate change. And that the key to that is operating, as you just said, on the micro level in terms of what's my experience in this place, and moving towards, without giving too much power on certain key citywide issues to a neighborhood group, which may be conservative, but fundamentally it's about neighborhood empowerment and neighborhood governance. When we're talking about place-centered nonprofits, they're neighborhood organizations. Mm-hmm. And how do you sustain them so that people's day-to-day experience, whether they're in the center of Times Square or whether they're in their neighborhood in Bed-Stuy, is appealing and competitive relative to other options?
Yeah, to the question of are we, question mark, right? Can we? Absolutely. I can speak for my own organization, the CID, and I think you may have seen the mural that we just had commissioned with the Embassy of Germany, and I think the UN was actually involved in this project as well that we're going to unveil next week on the topic of climate change and how women are disproportionately affected and how they can be part of addressing the solution. We're going to have this conversation next week within our own organization, we have in our strategic plan an intentional purpose to sort of help close gaps, raise the bottom, and show all that can be possible in a community like ours, in Mount Vernon Triangle, and then how we can create these practices and replicate them. A few years ago, a colleague of mine and I were working on a project to help sustain our parks, right? Citywide effort and initiative. And one of the things that we thought was very important was that any funding that came in support of this effort to help sustain our parks, that a percentage of it also be made available citywide. And that we create a knowledge base and a repository that anyone in any community could have access to, and along with some funding, so that they can also have nice parks in their communities. Because if we just created some nice parks in the bids, then where's the shared prosperity?
Yeah.
How do we all grow?
Like,
so I think there has to be some intentionality there.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because no community, no neighborhood lives in isolation. We're part of larger urban systems and a larger social fabric across a metropolitan landscape.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Ethan? Yeah, so I think to challenge place management organizations and networks, I do think that even more important than the city level, they're the level at which we're going to develop the systems that can address the sustainable development goals and so forth. But I want to back up, actually. The first time we met was in Habitat 3
Yes.
in Quito in 2016, which was actually the culmination for us of several years of working with you in Habitat to make public space and placemaking a global cause. That those efforts started actually with a conference that Rich Bradley and Ellen McCarthy came to in Stockholm. But that was to get public space into the SDGs and to develop. We got 10 different key messages into the New Urban Agenda to help build awareness. And I think so. And that was actually the first Urban Thinkers Campus with the World Urban Campaign.
Yeah.
And I've gotten to be involved in several since, and UN agencies and have done a great job of getting awareness for these issues and sort of laying out, what needs to be thought of and what needs to be included in. But in actually implementing these ideas, getting them to happen, the systems just aren't there. We're not going to solve the same problems with the systems that created them. And cities have a lot of power, and there's been lots of good efforts to network them. Actually, Sheila Foster, helped lead for a while the Global Parliament of Mayors, and but what's not networked is where the real innovation, again, the financial innovation, the governance innovation, but also cultural innovation. Real change, the biggest power for change in this world is cultural, and it's in destinations and how people create and preserve, respect, past culture, create new culture in these destinations that creates the fastest change that can go viral.
So powerful. It's so powerful. Let's pivot off of that and just do a quick round of reflection on the pandemic itself, because the pandemic, and this relates to this previous question that we had in the first panel. The pandemic was a moment of acute change. It was a moment when people who lived together in dense urban places all of a sudden felt threatened, and not just through perception, but through fact. And yet it has also been a period of extraordinary innovation in how we occupy the public realm. Where are you now, each of you, on the lessons learned from the pandemic, and how that either empowers place management organizations to move forward with a new agenda, or are we kind of rebuilding capacity that we lost?
One thing is, it was a reminder to me of something that I had taken for granted, which was that cities are still competing with non-cities. And so Ed Glazer wrote Triumph of the City, and during the pandemic he wrote I think it was Survival of the City. These battles aren't over yet, and the other thing so that's on the meta scale. On the micro scale, all these experiments with outdoor dining, a paradigm shift. We have this space, was used for cars. Let's just eliminate the rules, all these rules, and just within weeks, everywhere in the world, you had this explosion of entrepreneurial and creative energy that helped create a sense of community in a space that used to be just for cars, that helped smaller and independent businesses stay alive, and created vibrancy and helped us think in new ways about public space. And that, for me, and then there's a lot of mess to clean up about how do you put in a system to sustain it. But that's a metaphor for what we need to do to unleash the creative entrepreneurial power of people in places everywhere. Loosen these government restrictions, have guardrails to keep capitalism in check, but allow us to think about how we are going to use these public spaces differently in ways that make individual neighborhoods more vibrant and more competitive and more livable, and then make cities more vibrant and competitive and livable.
Yeah. Three things, and this is just my own experience running the CID during the pandemic: connection, meaning, and tapping into what were previously thought to be underutilized resources, right? Our parks, our streets, our alleys, our sidewalks. Connection. People long for connection. And that was really a big lesson learned for me. And even though the pandemic kept us apart, so to speak, just being able to, inspire, keep everyone connected. We would end every message that we would send out with the same, phrase, stay close, stay safe, stay connected. And so it was sort of that rallying cry, right? MBT connected was something we would constantly say, with the hashtag in a lot of our messages. And so people really had that desire for belonging, and people told us, like, we really appreciate you all, putting out messages weekly, how we can support one another, how we can support those, less able to provide for themselves. So that's one thing. Two, a meaning, just, back to what I said before, at our core, we all have sort of the same fundamental things that move us. When you're able to drive that as an organization and give people meaning, behind everything to show that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but here's what we're going to do, the little bit we can do to make things better for you and sort of to bring some joy in your life, that's really important. Having organizations like ours that are able to do that at a very hyperlocal level in a way that's sensitive to their communities is extremely important. And then third, when we, gradually began to open things up and people, began to go outside again, looking for opportunities to activate alleys, activate sidewalks. We did photo walk, along the sidewalk. We did an art activation in the alley. We closed down a street now for a farmer's market. It's one of the most popular and successful markets in the city now. Looking for ways to bring vibrancy and activation to these spaces that previously were thought places to avoid. These are just cut-throughs. Was a real big lesson learned for us. And I think the city Office of Planning sees that as well. And we're looking for ways to drive more activity in those spaces also.
Kenyatta, I don't want to miss the opportunity for you to share a little bit about your efforts to create a circular economy within your place.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so we created this little coupon book called MBT Bucks, right? And, we would have some event, Fall Fun Day, who had the cutest dog would get a $200 gift card, right? And so that's great. We would go to a local restaurant and we'd buy a $200 gift card. I still open my drawer at home and I see gift cards from 10 years ago that are probably expired now, right? And so the restaurant got the $200, but the utility value in it, for the individual who had it, they may or may not have used it. We worked with our businesses and we say, we want to really take that to the next level. We want a system that works for you, a system that works for us as a CID, because we want there to be some utility value there, and something that works for the resident, the business, especially as people were coming back into the office. And we wanted them to discover some of the businesses that were there that may have opened. And so we created this program called MVT Bucks, and we give them out all the time. When Hera was here doing the mural for us, we gave her MVT Bucks, which were used at one of our local businesses. Yeah. And so therefore, everyone's interests are aligned. I only pay the business to the extent that they're used, right? The person may or may not use them, but there's utility value because they receive something of tangible benefit. And the money stays in the community and people, they discover new businesses and they help sustain our businesses.
I think it's one of the most excellent examples of creative entrepreneurial activity on a place-based manner. And congratulations for getting that off the ground. It's really exciting. And you can imagine it continuing to grow. And of course, there are all kinds of secondary and tertiary impacts associated with a program like that.
Well, just funny story. I happened to be with Devontae Merrick last night, the former mayor of Ithaca, New York, at the age of 24, having gone to Cornell myself. And we had Ithaca dollars there, right? So the idea was something that, I was familiar with there, how they kept money within the Ithaca economy. We just applied it here, and it's been a huge success.
Yeah. Ethan, coming out of the pandemic, where are we? Are we, have we innovated? Are we in a better place now? Are we still catching up to what we lost? What's your assessment?
Yeah, well, I love Kenyatta's description of connection, and of course how these tools are accelerating connection and the virtuous cycles of connection in a place. I think I saw a lot of that happen during the pandemic. We sort of we first felt alone in a sense, but we also we craved to feel more connected to our immediate place, and we connected globally in a way that enabled us to sort of see our place on the planet and the need to make it work. And then we saw that the neighborhoods and districts that did well were the neighborhoods where people sort of almost competed to contribute back to their place, where they sort of self-organized. The bids and other place management entities often played a key role in facilitating it. But we also saw the challenges of some of the downtowns that, to use a word actually I learned from Tim, had been, before the pandemic, had become a little sclerotic, rigid. And I think of Saskia Sassen talks about how we need our downtowns, our cities, to be more porous and open and informal, and that's the design of them, the governance and the participation in them. And I think the districts that had more open management and participatory cultures and the ones that really came organized to do the dining decks, the streeteries, the open streets, those are the ones that worked well during the pandemic and are coming back out of it much stronger. And again, they've shown how place management is key, but also the self-organized, the way the neighbors in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, Brooklyn neighborhoods have never been more alive because of the small things that lots of neighbors did and lots of small businesses did to make it work.
That's great. I want to pivot. We have a wonderful question from the audience, and Ethan, I want to start with you on this, but I want to have a bigger conversation about this challenge, and that is that certainly in the media, there's a perception that these, practices associated with place management are really a set of practices that are harbored in big global cities. You hear the stories coming from Paris, the amazing narratives that we hear coming out of Barcelona. We have our incredible practices that have emerged in Washington and certainly in New York City. What is the obligation, or what is the kind of really the kind of learning infrastructure to spread these practices to cities around the world? And is that even a correct assumption on the basis of your experience that place management is only happening in big global cities? Really interested in this idea of the kind of conveyance and advancement of a global practice of place management. And Ethan, you probably spend more time on airplanes than any of us here, talking with practitioners on the ground in cities around the world. What are you hearing?
Yeah, well, first of all, before we go global, I want to say that our first work on place management in the U.S. started in rural communities with main streets, and the first business improvement districts were actually in small communities. So it's actually in rural areas and at the sort of the scale of Main Street, and actually very conservative communities that a lot of the best models for how to make cities work are proven. How that kind of sociability and connection is a foundation on which great cities are built. So we still have a lot to learn from there, and obviously we have to make rural communities help them to continue that legacy, and the innovation occurs on that level. But yeah, globally, again, we're seeing people coming to the place management from many different strengths and weaknesses. Every part of the world is, leading the placemaking movement, place management from different sectors. Some of the parts of the world I've worked in, that are probably I'm learning the most from, would probably be Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Sweden. Around from a place management perspective, a lot of them have dabbled in the idea of bids, but had, for various reasons, actually gone less far because, in a way, they haven't had the same crisis that we had here in the U.S. to address, but are learning all kinds of new innovations because of that. In Australian cities, I've gotten to work where they're realizing that they're achieving livability by delivering good places, but they're not creating place attachment or lovability. They're creating sort of a generic globalism, a sort of global monoculture. And so a lot of cities are creating nice places to be consumptive, but that correlates highly with sort of a negative gentrification potentially, or sort of a very consumptive, sort of passive relationship to place. And they see place attachment and lovability is actually a means to create livability more affordably, more inclusively, more quickly. And so that means a different type of place management model too, one that is about engaging people in co-creating the places and creating these virtuous cycles of creating local identity defined for and by local people, attracting new investment, new people on the terms of that local community that respects that as well. Yeah.
That's great. Thoughts on this kind of global education challenge?
I find it interesting that you frame it that way, Uwe, because
I'm framing the question that came in.
Okay,
yeah.
All right. Well, the question was framed that way because, certainly, we've sort of institutionalized and organized and documented, right, what it is, created models that could be replicated for efficiency, right, globally. I find that the best ideas that I gather around the work that I do are when I travel to less developed countries. I was in Cartagena last summer. And I remember going through some of the streets with, the umbrellas and, the items that hang overhead. And I said, oh, wow, this is like what they do in City Center here in DC, only more authentic, right? And so, we take these concepts and we bring them here. Typically, there's a financial incentive tied to them. You want people to come to your place so that they spend money. Whereas there in Cartagena, it felt like the currency was happiness. Right? And so, traveling there, or, I've traveled, through Beijing, right, and see the hutungs and how those are organized for familial connection, right? Not around sort of the financial incentive. So I actually think it kind of works both ways, just as much as, we can sort of spread in terms of, ways we can do things better around the edges, in less developed places. There's a lot that we can gain from the rest of the world as well, where placemaking, they don't even call it that. It's just organic. It's just the way they live, right? And it's tied to a sort of a different incentive model.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it has to do with the nature of media and how stories are told. Times Square was one of the most visible places on the planet.
Yeah.
So, but Times Square is very different. But I also used to say Times Square is like kind of town square of New York. And in any public space or in any place, there's a Times Square. There's a public space where I think it's in the public spaces where what's working or not working about society and about cities and about capitalism is made manifest. That's always true everywhere. And the business improvement model was started, in fact, by a small commercial strip in Toronto, Bloor Street, that was feeling threatened by a big commercial mall downtown. In the 70s in New York City, you had a group called Green Guerrillas that would throw seed bombs into vacant city-owned lots. That was the beginning of the community garden movement. But the stories, the narratives are often driven by the big cities. And so when Mayor Bloomberg and Jeanette Sadakan, his commissioner, closed a part of a major street in this city and this place that represented America, it helped with a paradigm shift about we can do different things with our streets.
Yes.
But the answer is not to say, oh, that has to happen everywhere, just like Ethan was saying. Each place has to have its own individual response. And structurally, we need to understand that Times Square is empowered and entitled and is going to get the money and resources and attention to get things done, as is most downtowns. But we have to look at the structural and systemic and financial tools to sustain those neighborhood-driven solutions in a way that we haven't been doing as much lately. That's where the work lies.
Tim, that's the perfect segue to our next question. The next question is really around financial models. And I would suggest, and it'll be interesting to see if you agree, that at least in the United States, and maybe also in the North American experience, place management organizations are paradoxically connected to business improvement districts. And business improvement districts have a kind of broadly accepted model around assessments or special taxes to finance those place management organizations. The next question is really more about community development and finding ways for other financial models that we've created for community development, such as community development finance institutes, to participate in this place management practice. Is that a stretch? is that something that you already see happening in some respects, and more specifically in the U.S. context, CDFIs in many cases are also place-based. But how can, and Ethan, you talked about these other models that you see emerging in Europe. How can place management move beyond its sole reliance on the business community or large property owners in a given place and diversify to new sources of revenue?
Sure. So I mentioned sort of Australia, where I've gotten to work a lot actually in this city in Adelaide, where I sort of Peter Smith was the CEO. He's now the board chair of PlacemakingX. And we worked with him to develop sort of these place capital metrics to sort of measure place more broadly across. So every department in the city was creating place, but to then help them realize that to do that, they need to devolve power to setting up some kind of management entity. And so this was coming from government in this case, and because there wasn't actually much participation from businesses or the private sector developers. So again, it's how do you diversify? Our sort of theory of change is you want to just keep diversifying the revenue stream, the participation, whatever whoever's owning it, or leading with the financial incentives or investment. You celebrate that, but you want to I think that's very much true with these the formation of these place management entities and the sort of trajectory of them. He talked about how first government needs to get a little bigger, but then it gets a little smaller as it devolves some power to these districts. But ultimately, it's about building relationships and trust, and a better relationship between government and communities. And there's no one right way to get there. And then you've got to continually ask, what is success? How are we measuring this? Yeah. What is, and that's the fuzziness of it, the tensions of it need to sort of be continually evolving as you go.
It's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know necessarily about the CDFI model, but I talked earlier about my colleague and I working on a new way to get funding into our parks and our open spaces, and this whole notion of value capture. And it's not how DC government budgets, right? It's kind of a capitated model. You have this many police officers, so we need this many dollars, and it's kind of spread across the city. And then they decide the agencies how they spend it and how they deploy it. It's approved by council. Yep. But the idea being we're decided to create a new place, right? And inherently there's value that's going to be created. Is there a way that place that's created, the value can be measured and then captured, even a percentage of it,
yep.
Right? Not all of it. Almost like in New York City, where they're capturing value of the subway, right? Or at least they're attempting to. And so that was an idea we posited. Getting our municipal leaders to think about sort of value and where it's created, and then how do we create that virtuous cycle so that some of that value can then be reharvested back into the communities at a very local level. I also think, though, however, and I think you were kind of touching on this, and that is, people perceive that we have sort of these split allegiances, right? Not even split, right? Mm-hmm. Your money comes from the developers, right? The owners. So therefore, when the conversation happens about what the public wants versus, that's where the conversation goes. My organization is different because we're also funded by residents, right? We're a community improvement district. So, everyone has equal say. But then we also have within our governance body the faith-based institutions that have been in our community for 410 years. Mm-hmm. They may not pay into the system, but they're part of the decision-making rubric. So I think just as important as how we fund our organizations is how we govern our organizations. Yes. And that's really important as well. So there's sort of this bottom-up and then there's this top-down perspective. And then hopefully everyone can meet in the middle and get to a place that's for the benefit of everyone as a whole, and everyone gets a little bit of what they want, maybe not necessarily all of what they want.
We've got one additional question here before we move into a conclusion, and that has to do with back to knowledge sharing and global engagement of practices, but the question specific to African cities. We have heard a couple of comments in earlier panels about South Africa, a lot of activity in South Africa. I myself have participated in some of those. And we are hoping this fall to conduct one of our roundtables in Lagos in Nigeria. But Ethan, you've been active across Africa. Share a little bit about your perspective of how place management plays out in cities in Africa.
Yeah, well, I don't have a great depth of experience, but we have helped set up an African public space network that's connecting placemaking practitioners around there, and then we also have an Arab placemaking network called the Amakan Network that's more North Africa, and you know looking at these issues in depth as well. But as you guys have pointed out, that a lot of the best place management is in these communities, informal or in some of the more formal parts of the cities as well. So obviously it's respecting, learning from, not erasing or dismantling those informal spaces. That's most important. We worked in Nairobi. We held a placemaking week there that did some temporary changes, sort of very similar to Times Square, very much inspired by Times Square, repainting the streets that led to and built the case for pedestrianizing spaces and with the management capacity that's necessary to maintain and activate those spaces. It never would have gotten there if it hadn't gone through this sort of participatory process. And there's groups I know in Johannesburg that are looking at place management. I've worked in Durban a bit on how placemaking can address perceptions of safety, of all kinds of safety, but also really more systemically address the causes behind them. And then Cape Town there's an entity we've worked with there called the Victoria and Albert Waterfront, which is actually a very commercialized private waterfront, but they're looking at how do you build networks for placemaking around Cape Town, and actually their employees come from the townships, and they give grants to support placemaking in the townships where their employees come from.
So interesting. Last round now. I'd ask for each of your individual reflections on the conversations that we'll have this fall. What are additional key issues that we should be exploring as we engage with people in this UTC format, and what challenges might there be that we highlight?
I think one of your questions was also about data, and I think it's data and systems and structures, and both a kind of developing along the lines of a recent book that Brookings did, looking at these governance structures, developing a taxonomy and understanding them, and finding out where are the gaps where we literally might have to develop some new tools. The tools of a Parks Conservancy or a BID, or it's over 50 years old. How's it need to evolve? And with respect to data, what gets measured gets done, and how we organize our data is how we organize ourselves. And Seth Lowe, who wrote a book about public spaces, said, imagine if we just organized our cities around public spaces. And I'd like to take that a little further and say, imagine if we organized our cities around places and neighborhoods. And now there's a capacity with the organization of data that wasn't there 20 years ago to organize the data so that we organize our government around places. So those are some of the systemic things I think we need to understand better, work with the practitioners in the field to say, what do you need and what tools can we give you structurally?
That's great.
I would agree 100% on data. I like to say within an organization, you are what you measure, right? You can say a lot of things about what you are, but at the end of the day, the measurables, the metrics, that's what policymakers really like. How many pounds of trash we pick up a year, believe it or not. I would also say technology. I'm constantly thinking, especially as a small organization, how can we use technology to leverage up? I don't know about AI and how that's gonna, play a role in place management. I'm not an expert in that stuff, but certainly, what are the new tools and new technologies that are out there? Being able to convene research and ideas and sort of, thought leaders like you are, and sort of best practices, and share those best practices, replicate those. And then governance. Governance is huge. I came in, with one perception of, because I came in new to the bid space, right, coming from the private sector, with one perception. But the more I sort of, I'm in this role, the more I realize that how you govern and who's part of your governance structure is very important to the actions and priorities you take place. Not every area that's bidless, that desires to have a bid, necessarily needs a bid. There may be some new tool, innovation, or approach that can be bid-like, without maybe the taxing system and everything else, that can achieve the same purpose,
Yep.
right? And that's the cohesion. So who do you bring into that tent? Who are the decision makers? And then what resources are able to be provided, either self-generated or from the municipal level, to help them achieve some of the goals that they want to achieve.
Yeah, so trying to build on this
Yeah.
amazing conversation. Yes, we need data that is more holistic. We can measure things much better. Than we've been doing, and certainly we value what we measure. In technology, how we employ that to get broader data and engage people in participatory data collection and so forth. And I think the even more powerful thing that needs to be informed by and built upon these foundations of opportunity is culture change, and the stories of transformation, because that's how big change ultimately happens, and it needs to be kept in check by past knowledge and learning and informed. But it's really about creating a paradigm shift from the dominant model of development of relation to our planet, which is place extractive, to being place creative, and this sort of creating these virtuous cycles that we talked about, telling the stories of these transformations when people moved from being place extractive to creating places that often facilitated by place management entities. That's what needs to go viral. And when people become part of this and see the happiness, to become part of the joy, that's undeniable. That goes beyond the transformation that people feel and how they themselves become co-creators of those spaces, how they become transformed by great places, and bring that back to make their places around the world. We need to network those stories, those people. And place managers are often the best people in the world. They're deeply connected to place. But one challenge is we can't be parochial. We can't just be, if we just fixing our own places isn't enough. We need to connect, challenge each other to work collectively, to realize we each have key pieces of the solution of place management. We each understand the challenges in key ways that need to be shared. We're learning, the deep learning is happening there, but if we don't network it globally through conversations like this, we're not going to solve our biggest challenges. Plug for you guys and anyone to come to we have a global placemaking summit in Mexico City. One way we want to plug into and support this place governance conversation. Many of the leaders we've talked about will be there the first week of November. But we'll also have many virtual opportunities to connect on these issues and build on this. This is the most important issue that we can all work on, and it falls between the cracks of so many global networks and organizations. But it's the leading edge, as you say. Yeah. It's the opportunity to disrupt and reconnect so many important fields right now.
Thank you for that. Thanks to each of you. What a fantastic panel. I want to thank each of you for participating and also your partnership. I'd also like to thank all of the participants in this virtual meeting and hope that you will continue to engage with us over the next 3 months. We will be having additional activities, smaller in scope, where we hope to find case studies and find the stories that we can elevate to the UN habitat. I'd especially like to thank today's speakers, you and all of our other speakers. It serves as a terrific point of departure for these future conversations. I'd like to thank our project partners, the International Downtown Association, the Urban Land Institute, PlacemakingX, and the Marin Institute of Urban Management at New York University. I'd like to thank all of our partners here at Georgetown for helping us put on an event like this. Really big thanks to all of you. And I look forward to future roundtable discussions that'll be smaller in format, and that will all conclude in an additional event like this that we'll hold on December 8th. Big thanks to everyone. Stay engaged. We also have a social media strategy associated with this. Thanks for participating, and this meeting is now adjourned.